I rise today to offer new legislation that I urge all of my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to support. And I'm pleased to be joined by Senators Carper, Akaka, Lieberman, Collins, and Voinovich as original co-sponsors of this bill. The legislation we offer today, the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act of 2010, is directly aimed at improving the operations and quantifying the results across the federal government. I think most of my colleagues know I'm a business guy. In fact, I've spent more time in the business world than in the public sector. I've always tried to apply common sense business practices to the work of government. In my former job as Virginia governor, and now as United States Senator. And let me tell you, and this is a point that I think most of us on both sides of the aisle would acknowledge, if I ran a business, or if we ran any business, like we run the federal government, I'd be out of business in short order. And if we don't change, as we hear the kind of folks across America say, we want to see more efficiency from our federal government, if we don't change, our government might get run out of business as well. As chair of the Budget Committee Task Force on Government Performance, over the last 18 months, I've been looking into how we use data and information to improve government operations. Over the last year, our task force has held a series of hearings, meetings, and conversations with public and private sector leaders from every level of government to learn more about what works and what doesn't work. Here's what we've learned. At the beginning of every president's administration, it seems an entirely new performance agenda is established. The Bush administration had the president's management agenda, and the current administration has its own accountable government initiatives. With this frequent changes in approach, every 4 to 8 years, it's difficult to ensure that we're consistent in the data we collect, use the best tools and technology to analyze it, and then put the necessary accountability in place to orderly track performance in the basic functions of what government does. Let me give you a couple examples. Agencies produce literally thousands of pages of data each year. But too often, we don't use it. We don't use it in Congress. Public interest groups don't use it. Enormous efforts are put into collecting this data, then it goes to sit on the shelf. Typically, this performance data is only reported once a year, so it's often too late by the time we discover whether we are improving or falling behind. We also don't compare the results for similar programs. Too often, so many of our government functions are siloed by agency or department, and rarely is this data analyzed in any kind of cross-cutting fashion. We in the task force took a look at this. We looked, for example, at workforce training programs across the federal government. We are currently funding 44 separate federal programs in 9 different departments to support workforce training. Now, we all would agree that in a changing world, workforce training is key to America's competitiveness. But 44 programs in 9 different departments without any kind of cross-cutting analysis? No business could operate that way. And it's not just workforce training. Food safety, a piece of legislation that we're working on that I know the presiding officer hopes that we pass before the end of the year to put new food safety standards in place. But in food safety, we currently fund 17 different entities within 7 different departments involved in food safety activities. So how can we assess what's working and what's not working? In short, government operates in silos. We report by agency and by program, but we don't know what we're doing in government in any particular project area or specific policy goal area. We need a better system that enables us to review the results of each program as a whole in terms of how they feed into a policy objective, where we're having the most impact, and candidly, where we could find some room to cut or curtail. Our federal performance system also needs to increase the accountability of senior agency leadership. In many agencies, The performance planning and reporting is disconnected from the senior officials and not part of the daily operations of the agency. In other words, somebody's got this task, but their functions of performance audits and measurements and metrics does not have a direct line of report to whoever the chief operating officer of the particular agency is. Now, I can say at the state and local area, we've actually made some progress in changing this around. Let me parochially start with what we did in Virginia. A little bit busy, but we created a Virginia Performs website. We use this to track progress in key policy areas that are important to Virginians. So whether it's economy, education, and we set common sense goals that everyone can agree on across party lines, and then we look at the measurement criteria that leads to that goal. This is one of the reasons why Virginia has earned the recognition as the best managed state in the country. It's not just happening in Virginia, though. In Indiana, a different tool has been created. It's called the Transparency Portal by Governor Mitch Daniels. It, again, tries to bring transparency to the policy goals. Then we can argue about how we get there or how we ought to fund how we get there. But unless we have common agreement on the goal and then see which programs lead to that goal and measure the effectiveness of the individual programs, we're not going to get, particularly in these budget-constrained times, to the best value for a federal tax dollar. I believe that Washington has much to learn from these local and state-level examples in setting goals, in holding managers accountable, and using performance metrics in a consistent, user-friendly way. State and local decision makers don't have to wait to look at the results once a year. They do it constantly. That's what we did in Virginia. That's what we need to do in our nation's capital as well. Now, in addition to these reporting and cross-cutting, we also need to recognize that this burdensome reporting requirements, that not all the reporting requirements are of equal value. So the task force is focused on reducing reporting requirements to identify what reporting might be consolidated or eliminated. If you get overwhelmed with data at certain points, the data becomes somewhat less useful. So we want to focus these agencies on which are the key determinants that they ought to report. I don't want to just add new reports and data requirements to agencies. There are bookshelves all over this town sagging from the weight of unread reports. So we must streamline and modernize what we are currently doing, and we need to examine outdated and overlapping agency reporting. We should only collect information that is useful. So, the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act addresses many of our findings to improve the operations and results of state government, results across government. First, it will require all agencies to produce real-time data on results. As I mentioned earlier, in the past, agencies would report performance only once a year. This bill would require agencies to post results quarterly so the public and Congress can use that real-time information about what works on targeted goals. With today's technology, and if you're collecting data on an ongoing basis, there's no reason why we should have this information only come out once a year. A quarterly requirement will allow us to correct and fine-tune on an ongoing basis. Second, the bill requires agencies to post data on a single public website. This website will contain performance information from across government so that we can see how we are performing and how national priorities like education, public health, safety are met. Again, I go back to the Virginia Performs works. You agree on the top line policy goal, and then you see across agencies how all these different programs feed in. So posting this on a single public website, rather than having members of Congress or the public sort through the myriad of sites right now, I think is a step in the right direction. Third, agencies will be required to identify low priority programs that are not adequately contributing to the overall results. Now, this is controversial. Every agency likes to talk about its best performing programs. No agency likes to talk about which programs really aren't getting the job done. But as we face increasingly budget-constrained times, we must make sure that we look not only at the winners, but that we have the agencies themselves put forward those areas where programs aren't meeting the goals. Fourth, we need to take important steps to improve accountability of senior officers in government agencies. We formally establish that agency deputy secretaries are the chief operating officers and hold them accountable for the results that the agencies are looking for. Again, you've got to have a chain of command so that somebody knows who's the chief operating officer, and those people who are performing are responsible, and those metrics are reported to that chief operating officer. We also establish a performance investment officer that reports directly to the COO, and again, works across agencies to meet our cross-cutting goals. We also feel that these efforts will generate back-office savings, and we have as a policy goal, and I don't believe this will be a stretch, literally a 10% reduction in written reports. We sometimes get overloaded with data. We want to fine-tune the data. We want to make sure that the more useful data is reported on a more regular basis, that extraneous amounts, some of the kind of burdensome stuff that's put in the past that may no longer be relevant, we want to eliminate. And then within the agency, we want to make sure that there's a clear chain of command. The Government Performance and Results Modernization Act, I think, moves us forward in a major way. So this legislation, common sense business practices, bipartisan, in an effort that will meet the 10% reduction in agency reports, the effort finally to make sure that we can look at policy goals not by individual department or agency, but across programmatic areas. The same kind of business techniques that are used in Fortune 500 companies all across America, and for that matter, all across the world. This act will bring these best practices into the federal government and make sure that we don't have this kind of start and stop effort that has unfortunately plagued modernization efforts over the past. I would urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, since this is bipartisan supported, to join in this effort. And as we think about many of the major issues that we kind of fight through in these remaining days of this Congress, I hope this kind of common sense piece of legislation that could get the time needed to get passed. And again, I urge my colleagues to join us in this effort.